Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The city of Victoria, British Columbia, stretches along the southern tip of Vancouver Island like a jewel pressed against the Pacific Ocean. Its streets lined with gardens and heritage buildings that speak to a gentler, quieter way of life. In early 2008, the nearby suburb of Saanich was experiencing the kind of growth that brings optimism. New developments, families moving in, houses being built on quiet cul-de-sacs where children could play without fear. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other by name, where violent crime was rare enough to be shocking when it happened. For 24-year-old Lindsay Buzayak, this was the perfect landscape for building a career in real estate. Born on November 2nd, 1983, to parents Jeff and Evelyn, Lindsay had grown up with the kind of brightness that people remember long after they've met her. Her father would later describe her as a spectacular young woman who could make friends with everybody, someone whose energy was so infectious that you wanted to be part of her life. Friends said she was bubbly, caring, and driven. A young woman who approached her work with genuine enthusiasm and a desire to help people find not just houses, but homes. Lindsay had already made a promising start to her real estate career despite being relatively junior in the industry. She worked hard, building relationships with clients and learning the intricacies of the market. In a field where success often comes from reputation and referrals, Lindsay was establishing herself as someone trustworthy, someone who would go the extra mile to find exactly what her clients needed. Her boyfriend, Jason Zalo, came from a prominent and wealthy family that owned a successful real estate business, and some believed that connection would only help Lindsay's career flourish in the years ahead. But on February 2nd, 2008, everything changed. The events that led to that terrible day began in late January, when Lindsay received a phone call that immediately unsettled her. The caller was a woman who spoke with a foreign accent that Lindsay couldn't quite place. She later described it to her father as kind of Spanish, but not really. Something that sounded deliberate, perhaps even fake. The woman introduced herself and explained that she and her husband were urgently seeking to purchase a home in the Victoria area. Their budget was $1 million, and they needed to move quickly, ideally within just 2 days. The request was unusual in several ways. First, there was the urgency. Most home purchases, especially at that price point, involve careful consideration, multiple viewings, inspections, and negotiations. But this couple seemed to want to bypass all of that, moving with a speed that felt almost frantic. Second, there were the specific requirements scrawled in Lindsay's day planner after the call. At least 3 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a separate area for a housekeeper. The couple wanted a property in move-in ready condition, something they could step into without any renovations or delays. But what bothered Lindsay most was a detail that should have been routine. She asked the caller how she had obtained her personal cell phone number. As a relatively junior agent, Lindsay's contact information wasn't widely circulated. The woman claimed that one of Lindsay's previous clients had shared it with her, but the explanation felt thin, unconvincing. Lindsay couldn't shake the feeling that something about the call was off, that the whole situation carried an undercurrent of wrongness that she couldn't quite articulate. She confided her concerns to both Jason and her father, Jeff. Jason, however, saw the opportunity rather than the risk. He encouraged Lindsay to meet with the clients, pointing out that the commission from $1 million sale would be substantial and could be a significant boost to her career. To reassure her and ease her anxiety, he offered to wait outside the property in his car during the showing, close enough to intervene if anything went wrong. With that safety net in place, Lindsay agreed to move forward. She found a suitable property at 1702 De Souza Place, a house in a small cul-de-sac in the upscale Gordon Head area of Saanich. The location was ideal, quiet, safe, and prestigious. The house itself was vacant and had been recently cleaned, ready for showings. Lindsay arranged an appointment with the mysterious couple for 5:30 p.m. on Saturday, February 2nd, 2008. In her BlackBerry, she had saved the clients under a nickname that reflected the accent she had heard on the phone: the Mexicans. That Saturday afternoon, Lindsay and Jason went to lunch at a local restaurant, enjoying a relaxed meal together before they would each head off to their respective commitments. They paid the bill at 4:24 p.m. and then departed separately in their own vehicles. It's believed that Lindsay returned home to change her clothes before the showing, wanting to look professional and polished for what could be an important sale. Jason, meanwhile, traveled to an automobile repair shop to drop off some paperwork and pick up a colleague. He was running late, and CCTV footage from the auto shop would later show him leaving with his friend at exactly 5:30 p.m., the same time Lindsay was scheduled to meet her clients. Throughout the afternoon, Lindsay and Jason exchanged text messages. She was aware that he would be late arriving at the property, but that didn't seem to worry her. She had done showings before, and this was supposed to be routine. De Souza Place was a small cul-de-sac containing only 4 houses. Number 1702 sat at the outer end, where the cul-de-sac intersected with Torquay Drive, a main thoroughfare. The side of the property and the fence of the back garden ran parallel to Torquay Drive, making it accessible from 2 directions. Part of the cul-de-sac was still under construction, supervised by developer Joe De Souza, a friend and business associate of Jason's mother, Shirley Zalo. De Souza had been at the location an hour before the showing, overseeing construction work, though police would later state that no one in the Zalo family or their associates was considered a suspect. At 5:30 p.m., 2 witnesses saw something that would later become crucial to the investigation. They observed a man and a woman walking up the cul-de-sac toward number 1702. The man was approximately 6 feet tall, Caucasian, with dark hair, dressed well. The woman was also Caucasian, between 35 and 45 years old, with short blonde hair, and she wore a distinctive dress, black and white with either red or pink accents, a pattern striking enough that the witnesses would remember it clearly. The witnesses watched as Lindsay greeted the couple outside the house. What struck them most was the nature of the greeting. Lindsay and the couple shook hands in a formal manner that suggested they had never met before, that this was indeed a first meeting between a real estate agent and prospective clients. Detective Sergeant Chris Horsley would later say that the witnesses were quite firm in their observation, satisfied that the people who showed up were not known to Lindsay. After the handshake, Lindsay and the couple entered the house together. Jason and his colleague arrived at the cul-de-sac around 5:40 p.m., about 10 minutes after Lindsay had gone inside with the couple. As Jason drove toward the property, he saw a figure through the glass of the front door. Not wanting to be a nosy, interfering boyfriend, he decided to park outside and wait. After sitting there for about 10 minutes, he drove to another street to give Lindsay more space, assuming she was still conducting the showing and didn't need him hovering. At 5:38 p.m., Jason texted Lindsay to tell her he was just a couple of minutes away. She never opened the message. 3 minutes later, at 5:41 p.m., Lindsay's BlackBerry made an outgoing call. Authorities would later believe this was a pocket dial, an accidental call made as Lindsay was being killed, her phone pressed against her body in the chaos and violence of those final moments. After 20 minutes had passed since Jason first arrived and saw movement inside the house, his concern began to grow. He went to the front door and tried to open it, but it was locked. Through the mottled glass on the front door, he could see Lindsay's shoes in the entrance hall, but there was no sign of movement, no sound, no response to his repeated knocking. He texted Lindsay again, "Are you okay?" When she didn't respond, his worry escalated into genuine fear. At 6:05 p.m., Jason called 911 to report that he couldn't get a hold of his girlfriend. While he was on the phone with the operator, His colleague found a gap in the fence in the back garden and entered the yard. What he saw sent a chill through him. The back patio door was wide open, swinging gently in the evening air. He called to Jason, who told the 911 operator that the two men were entering the house. Jason then ended the call. Jason's colleague passed through the main level of the house and unlocked the front door from the inside to admit Jason, who immediately ran upstairs toward the master bedroom. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lindsay was lying on her back in a pool of blood, her body motionless. Jason rushed to her side and tried to perform CPR, but when he felt her skin, he knew immediately that it was too late. She was already passed away, he would later recall, his voice breaking. He called 911 a second time, and emergency services arrived soon after. Paramedics pronounced Lindsay dead at the scene. She had been stabbed multiple times, more than 40 times according to later reports, in her head and chest. The brutality of the attack was shocking, the number of wounds suggesting rage, hatred, or a deeply personal motive. But there were no defensive wounds on her body, which indicated that she had likely been stabbed from behind first, with no warning, no chance to fight back or protect herself. She would have had no indication of what was about to happen until the blade pierced her flesh and her world erupted into pain and terror. None of Lindsay's possessions had been stolen. Her purse, her phone, her keys, all were left behind. She had not been sexually assaulted. This was not a robbery gone wrong, not a crime of opportunity. This was something far more calculated, far more deliberate. Jason and his colleague were immediately taken into custody for questioning, as is standard procedure when someone discovers a body. But their version of events was quickly verified through the time-stamped surveillance footage from the auto shop, which proved conclusively that they could not have committed the murder. They were released without charge. Over the years that followed, Jason would be interviewed multiple times by the Saanich Police Department, and he always cooperated fully. He also passed a polygraph test. Police publicly cleared him about a year after Lindsay's death, stating that there was nothing to connect him to the crime. The investigation into Lindsay's murder revealed just how meticulously the crime had been planned. The house had been cleaned just before the showing, which meant the crime scene yielded no DNA, no fingerprints, no physical evidence whatsoever. Investigators came to believe that the murder was well organized and executed by people who had killed before, people who understood how to avoid leaving traces of themselves behind. The police developed a theory about how the killers escaped. They believed that when Jason first arrived at the property around 5:40 p.m. and saw the figure through the glass of the front door, he was actually seeing the killers preparing to leave. When Jason parked outside, the killers retreated back into the house and fled through the back patio door instead, leaving it open as they passed through the fence and made their way to a vehicle they had parked on Torquay Drive. This theory was consistent with the witnesses' statements that the unknown couple had been walking, not driving, up the cul-de-sac, and with the fact that all vehicles parked in the cul-de-sac that day were accounted for and belonged to residents. The cell phone used by the mysterious woman to contact Lindsay became a critical piece of evidence. Investigators traced it to a burner phone that had been purchased at a Vancouver convenience store between 3 and 6 weeks before the murder. The phone had been registered under the name Paulo Rodriguez, which authorities determined was fake. It was registered to a legitimate business address in Vancouver, but police believed the business had no connection to the case, and that the address was simply chosen at random to provide a layer of misdirection. What made the phone even more significant was the pattern of its use. It had never been used until it was activated less than 48 hours before Lindsay's murder. Cell phone tower pings showed that the phone had traveled on the ferry from Vancouver to Vancouver Island the day before the murder. After Lindsay's death, the phone was deactivated and has never been used since. Authorities believe the phone was purchased and used for the sole purpose of luring Lindsay to her death, a chilling indication of premeditation and planning. Public records released in 2020 revealed that police had been aware of 2 phones used by the suspects. One with a Vancouver number used only to contact Lindsay, and another used to check the voicemail of the first phone. There had also been unusual internet activity associated with Lindsay before her murder, though the nature of that activity has not been publicly disclosed. With few physical leads, investigators turned their attention to the people in Lindsay's life, searching for someone who might have had a motive to want her dead. They looked into her ex-boyfriend, Matt McDuff, whom she had dated from 2001 to 2006. Friends described him as her Mr. Big, a reference to Carrie Bradshaw's on-again, off-again relationship in the television series Sex and the City. But McDuff insisted he had nothing to do with the murder, and authorities confirmed that he and Lindsay hadn't spoken in months at the time of her death. Police found no evidence to tie him to the crime. Investigators also explored the possibility that Lindsay had accidentally seen or heard something that put her life in danger. While police didn't believe Lindsay was involved in anything illegal, they acknowledged that there was an element of people she associated with that were involved in crime. In December 2007, about 8 weeks before her murder, Lindsay had tried to contact the friend of her ex-boyfriend while visiting Calgary. On January 22, 2008, the largest drug bust in Alberta's history took place, and that friend was arrested and accused of being a major participant in a drug trafficking operation. Some speculated that Lindsay's murder may have been ordered by a drug cartel because she was believed to be a police informant. Detectives investigated that possibility, but quickly eliminated it as a motive. Lindsay was not an informant, and the personal, brutal nature of her murder didn't fit the method of operation typically used by hired killers working for cartels. Crime scene investigator Yolanda McClary and veteran homicide detective Dwayne Stanton both agreed that while the murder appeared professional in its planning and lack of evidence, it was too brutal and amateurish in execution to be a contracted hit. Another drug-related theory was also investigated and dismissed. One man's phone had been tapped because of his involvement in narcotics trafficking in British Columbia and Alberta, and during those wiretaps, law enforcement uncovered information that led to raids on the BC legislature in 2003. Lindsay's phone and Jason's phone had also been tapped because of his association with the group. However, the theory was quickly dismissed because Lindsay had no known involvement with drug use or trafficking and was not included in the defense's witness list during any related trial. The investigators came to believe that Lindsay's murder was very personal and planned by someone close to her, perhaps by someone who had access to inside information from the real estate office where she worked. But despite years of investigation, thousands of hours of work, and extensive public interest in the case, no arrests have ever been made. In February 2021, Saanich police announced that advancements in DNA analysis and other technology had created new leads in the case. But as of early 2026, 18 years after Lindsay's death, the case remains unsolved. Lindsay's father, Jeff Buzayak, has become a tireless advocate for justice. He moved to Calgary, but returns to Victoria every February to lead an annual walk in remembrance of his daughter and to keep her case in the public eye. He has spent thousands of dollars in the pursuit of justice, including offering a reward that once reached $500,000 for information leading to an arrest. He hired private investigators and research firms, refusing to let the case fade into obscurity. "I'm not going to let her down," Jeff told Dateline correspondent Josh Mankiewicz. "The only way I'm going to stop right now finding out who killed her is die myself, and I'll be dying trying. I'll guarantee you that." Lindsay's mother has also spoken publicly about the pain of living without answers. "Another year without closure, without knowing who or why," she said in a 2025 statement. The murder shocked the quiet community of Saanich, which typically averages just one homicide each year. For residents, the idea that someone could be lured to their death in broad daylight, on a quiet cul-de-sac where houses were being built and families were moving in, shattered any sense of safety. For real estate agents, Lindsay's death became a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities inherent in their profession, meeting strangers in empty houses, often alone, trusting that the people they're helping are who they claim to be. In August 2017, someone posted a comment on the investigative website run by Jeff Buzayak that read, "I killed Lindsay and stupid cops will never prove it." Whether the comment was a cruel hoax or a genuine confession from someone involved in the murder remains unknown. The case has been featured on numerous true crime programs and podcasts, including NBC's Dateline and the Case File True Crime podcast. Each retelling brings renewed attention to the mystery, renewed hope that someone somewhere knows something that could break the case open. But for Lindsay's family and friends, the unanswered questions are a weight that never lifts. Who were the man and woman in the distinctive dress who walked up D'Souza Place that February evening? Why did they target Lindsay specifically? Was it someone she knew, someone who had carefully constructed an elaborate plan to lure her to her death? Or was she a random victim, chosen for reasons that may never make sense to anyone except her killers? Lindsay Buzayak was 24 years old when she died, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was building a career, nurturing relationships, making plans for a future she would never see. Her father described her as someone who could make friends with everyone, someone whose presence made the world brighter. "How could you possibly think you'd want her dead?" he asked, a question that echoes through the years without answer. On that Saturday evening in February 2008, Lindsay walked into 1702, D'Souza Place, believing she was helping a couple find their dream home. She shook hands with them outside, stepped through the front door, and within minutes, her life was taken in an act of violence so brutal and so calculated that it still defies understanding. The house stands empty now, a silent witness to what happened in its upstairs bedroom. The cul-de-sac continues its quiet existence, families coming and going, children playing in yards, life moving forward as it always does. But for those who knew Lindsay, for those who loved her, time stopped on February 2nd, 2008, and it won't start again until there are answers, until there is justice, until someone is held accountable for taking a bright, beautiful life and leaving nothing in its place but questions and grief. Solving this case means justice for Lindsay, everyone who loved her, and women who are victims of violence everywhere, Jeff Buzayak said. And so he walks every February, carrying his daughter's memory through the streets of Victoria, refusing to let the world forget, refusing to let her become just another unsolved case filed away in a dusty archive. Lindsay Buzayak deserves more than that. She deserves answers. She deserves justice. And until that day comes, her story remains a haunting reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly trust can be weaponized, and how a single phone call can change everything. Story 2. The prairie sky stretched wide over Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, in March of 2015, when winter still clung to the air and the Saskatchewan River moved slow and cold through the heart of the city. In that particular landscape, where the land flattens toward the horizon and the nights can feel endless, 18-year-old Brittany Gargle was counting down the weeks until her high school graduation. She was the kind of young woman people noticed, not because she demanded attention, but because her energy radiated in ways that were genuine and warm. Friends described her as bubbly and hyper, someone who approached life with an openness that made her easy to love. Brittany had dreams that reached far beyond the small circles she traveled. She talked about building hotels one day, about creating something lasting and meaningful, about turning ambition into reality. To fund those dreams, she worked multiple jobs, balancing shifts at a local pizzeria with her studies, proving to everyone around her that she was willing to do the hard work required to make her aspirations real. Her life had not been without struggle. Brittany had been raised by her grandmother, stepping into that arrangement because her mother battled addiction and her father was largely absent from her world. Yet rather than letting those circumstances define her negatively, Brittany seemed determined to rise above them. She found ways to make the best of what she had, building friendships that felt like family and working toward a future that looked brighter than her past. One of those friendships was with a young woman named Cheyenne Antoine. Cheyenne was also 18 years old, and like Brittany, she carried the weight of a difficult childhood. She had lost both of her parents early in life and grew up in the foster care system, enduring experiences that no child should have to face, including sexual abuse. The two girls had known each other since ninth grade, bonding over the struggles they shared and the understanding that came from living lives shaped by loss and hardship. To the outside world, they appeared to be close friends, the kind who leaned on each other when things got hard and celebrated together when life offered moments of joy. On the evening of March 23, 2015, Brittany decided to take a break from the relentless pace of work and school. She and Cheyenne made plans for a night out in Saskatoon, intending to enjoy the kind of carefree evening that teenagers crave after weeks of responsibility and routine. Before they headed into the city, they stopped by the home of a mutual friend, Adisha Story. Brittany asked Adisha if she could borrow some money for gas, a small request that carried no hint of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Adisha handed over the cash and, in the casual way friends do, reminded Brittany to be careful. She told her to call if she needed a ride, to reach out if anything felt wrong. Brittany gave her a hug, warm and quick, the kind of gesture that feels unremarkable in the moment, but takes on unbearable weight in hindsight. That hug was the last time Adisha would see her friend alive. At 2 minutes past midnight on March 24, 2015, Brittany and Cheyenne posted a selfie on social media. The photo captured them together at Brittany's grandmother's home, getting ready for their night out, their faces bright with anticipation. The image was playful and friendly, showing no signs of tension or conflict, nothing to suggest that within hours, one of them would be dead and the other would be responsible. It would be Brittany's last known correspondence with the world. That night, the two young women went out drinking, visiting bars, and moving through the city's nightlife. Alcohol flowed freely, and at some point, they also used marijuana, adding another layer of impairment to an evening that was spiraling toward disaster. They ended up at a house party sometime in the early morning hours. Their memories of the night were hazy, blurred by substances and exhaustion, but at some point around 4:30 in the morning, they stopped at a McDonald's. It was a mundane detail, the kind of late-night ritual that happens in cities everywhere. Young people sobering up over fast food, trying to shake off the fog before heading home. But somewhere between the party and the drive that followed, something shifted. An argument erupted between Brittany and Cheyenne. To this day, the reason remains unclear. Cheyenne would later claim she could not remember what sparked the fight, could not recall the words exchanged or the grievance that ignited the violence. What is certain is that the disagreement escalated beyond shouting, beyond the kind of conflict that friends navigate and move past. It became physical. In the dark hours before dawn, on a remote road on the outskirts of Saskatoon, near the city landfill where the landscape turns desolate and the lights of the city fade into emptiness, Cheyenne strangled her best friend to death. She used a belt, a black, braided belt that she had been wearing earlier in the evening, visible in that final selfie they had posted together just hours before. The belt wrapped around Brittany's throat, cutting off her air, pressing into her skin with enough force to leave marks that matched the weave of the leather. Brittany fought, her body responding with desperate instinct, but the struggle was brief and ultimately futile. When it was over, Brittany lay motionless on the cold ground, her shoes missing, her body already beginning to cool in the pre-dawn chill. Cheyenne left her there. She abandoned her friend's body on Valley Road, a lonely stretch near the landfill, and walked away into the darkness. What went through her mind in those moments remains known only to her. Fear, perhaps. Shock. The terrible realization of what she had done. Or maybe, in her intoxicated state, she did not fully grasp the enormity of it yet, did not yet understand that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. At 6 o'clock that morning, a passing motorist spotted something unusual on the side of the road. He stopped his vehicle and approached cautiously, his stomach sinking as he realized what he was seeing. A young woman lying on her back, cold to the touch, unresponsive. He called for help immediately, and within minutes, emergency responders and police officers from the Saskatoon Police Service arrived at the scene. Attempts to resuscitate the victim were made, but there were no signs of life. The woman was pronounced dead at the scene, and investigators quickly realized they were dealing with a homicide. The signs were unmistakable: bruising around her throat, marks consistent with strangulation, the clear evidence of violent force. Sergeant Ernie Laudit of the Saskatoon Police Service surveyed the scene with the careful eye of someone who had seen too many tragedies. The victim was unidentified at that moment, but she was clearly young, her life cut short with brutal efficiency. Near her body, investigators collected several items: a leather jacket, a woman's watch, and that black braided belt, still lying on the ground as if discarded carelessly. Because they did not yet know who she was, police took photographs of her tattoos, a few stars and a lion's head, and released them to the public, hoping someone would recognize the markings and come forward with information. When Adishaw's story saw the images on the news later that morning, her world collapsed. She recognized the tattoos immediately. The girl who had hugged her just 9 hours earlier, who had borrowed money for gas and promised to be careful, was gone. Adishaw dropped onto her couch and began to cry, overwhelmed by the impossibility of it, the senselessness. She called the police and confirmed what they needed to know. The victim was Brittany Gargle. As investigators began the grim work of piecing together Brittany's final hours, they turned to her social media accounts, looking for any clue that might point them toward a suspect. What they found was both revealing and chilling. Hours after Brittany's body had been discovered, Cheyenne Antoine had posted a message on Brittany's Facebook page. "Where are you? Haven't heard from you. Hope you made it home safe." To the casual observer, it looked like a concerned friend reaching out, worried about someone who had not checked in. But to investigators, it raised immediate questions. Why would someone post publicly on social media instead of calling or texting directly? Why perform concern in such a visible way? The post felt performative, as if designed to create a false narrative, to establish distance between Cheyenne and whatever had happened to Brittany. Police decided to pay Cheyenne a visit. When they interviewed her, Cheyenne offered a detailed account of the night. She said that she and Brittany had gone bar hopping, starting at the Manchester Brew Pub and eventually making their way to the Colonial Pub and Grill. She claimed that at some point around 4 in the morning, they attended a house party, and that Brittany had started hanging out with an unknown man in his 30s. According to Cheyenne, she and Brittany eventually parted ways, and Cheyenne was dropped off at an assisted living facility where her uncle lived. To support her story, Cheyenne even got her uncle on the phone with the police, and he corroborated her account, confirming that she had visited him after 4 o'clock that morning. On the surface, the story seemed plausible, but as investigators began checking surveillance footage from the bars Cheyenne mentioned, cracks began to appear. While video confirmed that both women had been at the Manchester pub, there was no footage of them at the Colonial Pub and Grill. Senior Crown Prosecutor Robin Ritter would later describe the claim as fabricated. The visit to the Colonial simply did not happen. Furthermore, security footage from the assisted living facility showed that Cheyenne had never arrived there, despite what she and her uncle had told police. Her story was starting to fall apart. When confronted with the inconsistencies, Cheyenne's uncle broke down and admitted he had lied. According to him, Cheyenne had asked him to provide a false alibi and had fed him a new version of events. In this account, she claimed that she and Brittany had ended up at a motel with 2 black men, where they used drugs and alcohol. Cheyenne said they had fought over cocaine, and when she returned from the bathroom, she found Brittany lifeless on the bed with marks on her neck. One of the men, she claimed, had threatened her with a gun and forced her to help dispose of the body. Investigators were skeptical. They thoroughly investigated this second story and found no evidence to support it. There was no motel, no unknown men, no cocaine dispute. It was another fabrication, another attempt to deflect responsibility and create a false narrative. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of Brittany's body confirmed what investigators had suspected from the beginning. She had been strangled to death. The black braided belt found at the scene was identified as the murder weapon, and the marks on her neck matched the weave of the belt exactly. Importantly, there were no signs of sexual assault, which helped narrow the focus of the investigation. The belt was sent to a laboratory for DNA testing, and 2 profiles were found on it. One belonged to Brittany, and the other was unknown at that time. On May 3, 2015, 5 weeks after Brittany's murder, police brought Cheyenne in for another interview. This time, she was already in custody on unrelated shoplifting charges, making it easier for investigators to question her without the complications of tracking her down. But Cheyenne refused to cooperate. She would not talk about that evening at all, shutting down any attempt to get her to revisit the night Brittany died. By this point, it was obvious to everyone involved that Cheyenne was the prime suspect. But without conclusive evidence linking her directly to the crime, there was not enough to charge her with murder. The case began to lose momentum, and Brittany's loved ones grew frustrated and afraid that her death would become another cold case, another unsolved tragedy that faded from public attention. Then, in an unexpected turn, Brittany's family received a phone call from Cheyenne's aunt. According to the aunt, Cheyenne had returned home shortly after Brittany's time of death in a panicked state, drunk and crying. She had confessed to her aunt that she had strangled her friend. The aunt relayed this information to Brittany's family, who immediately contacted the police. When investigators followed up, the aunt repeated the same account, providing the critical breakthrough the case had been waiting for. Despite this new information, Cheyenne continued to deny involvement in Brittany's death. In fact, 6 months after the murder, on September 10, 2015, she posted another message on Brittany's Facebook page. "I miss you so much. You came and visited me in my dream last night. Miss you so much. You were way too young to go. Rest in paradise, my angel." The posts were haunting in their duplicity, a public performance of grief layered over the private knowledge of guilt. For 2 years, the case remained unresolved, the evidence compelling but not quite sufficient to secure an arrest. Then, in 2017, investigators had what senior Crown Prosecutor Robin Ritter described as an aha moment. They returned to the selfie that Brittany and Cheyenne had posted on social media just hours before Brittany's death. In the photo, Cheyenne was wearing a belt, the same black, braided belt that had been used to strangle Brittany Gargle to death. It was, as Sergeant Loudet later remarked, the kind of evidence that doesn't get much better when you're trying to prosecute someone for murder. The belt in the selfie was identical to the murder weapon found at the scene, providing a direct link between Cheyenne and the instrument of Brittany's death. New lab testing was conducted on the DNA found on the belt, and the unknown profile was confirmed to belong to Cheyenne Antoine. With this evidence in hand, police arrested her and charged her with second-degree murder. The arrest brought a mixture of emotions to Brittany's friends and family. There was relief that someone was finally being held accountable, but also shock and disbelief that the person responsible was someone Brittany had trusted, someone she had called a friend. After her arrest, Cheyenne finally opened up to investigators, offering yet another version of events. This time, she admitted that she and Brittany had gone to a house party and used drugs and alcohol. She said they were both heavily intoxicated, and that her last clear memory was from around 4:30 in the morning after they had been to McDonald's. She acknowledged that at some point she and Brittany had argued, but she claimed she could not remember what the argument was about. Cheyenne said she blacked out and could not recall the actual moments of Brittany's death, but that when she came to, she knew something terrible had happened. She accepted responsibility for the killing, but maintained that she had no memory of strangling her best friend. Prosecutors faced a challenge. They could not establish clear criminal intent or a definitive motive for the murder. Cheyenne offered no explanation for why she had killed Brittany, leaving a void where understanding might have been. Without proof of premeditated intent, the charges were reduced from second-degree murder to manslaughter. On January 15, 2018, Cheyenne Rose Antoine stood in a Saskatoon courtroom and pleaded guilty to manslaughter. It was a joint submission from both the Crown and the defense, and the judge sentenced her to 7 years in prison. For Brittany's family, the sentence felt insufficient. 7 years for a life taken, for a young woman with dreams and ambition who would never see her graduation, never build the hotels she talked about, never grow old. Brittany's stepmother, Vicky Wickenhauser, spoke to reporters after the sentencing, her voice heavy with grief and frustration. She was a wonderful person whose life was cut short, Wickenhauser said. And it's not fair. It's just not fair. The courtroom proceedings revealed the complicated nature of the investigation. The way police had used social media to develop timelines and identify contradictions in Cheyenne's stories. Crown Prosecutor Robin Ritter praised the investigative work, calling it remarkable how authorities had pieced together the truth from digital breadcrumbs, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence. But for all the investigative skill and technological tools that solved the case, there remained an aching emptiness at the center of it all. The absence of a clear motive, the unanswered question of why. Cheyenne's lawyer, Lisa Watson, acknowledged in court that Cheyenne knew Brittany's family wanted an explanation, a reason that might make sense of the senseless, but that unfortunately, she could not provide one. Whether that inability came from genuine memory loss due to intoxication or from a refusal to confront the full truth of what she had done, no one could say with certainty. What remained undeniable was the impact of that March night on everyone it touched. Brittany's friends carried the weight of her loss, the way grief reshapes a life and colors every memory. Her family was left to navigate a world in which their daughter, granddaughter, and friend was reduced to a case file, a news story, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking even in familiar friendships. For the community of Saskatoon, the case served as a stark reminder of how violence can erupt in the most unexpected places, between people who should have been safe with each other, who shared history and hardship, and should have been bound by loyalty and care. And for those who followed the case from a distance, it became a story about the ways modern technology, social media, surveillance cameras, DNA analysis, can illuminate the darkest corners of human behavior, turning selfies and Facebook posts into evidence that speaks louder than any testimony. Cheyenne Antoine became eligible for parole in 2024. Whether she has found within herself the capacity to fully understand and articulate what happened that night, whether she has been able to offer the answers that Brittany's loved ones still seek, remains unclear. What is clear is that on a cold March morning in 2015, an 18-year-old girl with a bright future was found dead on a lonely road, and the person responsible was someone she had trusted, someone she had called a friend. The tragedy of Brittany Gargle's death lies not only in the violence of it, but in the betrayal, the senselessness, and the unanswered questions that linger long after the courtroom doors close and the headlines fade. Brittany deserved to graduate, to build her hotels, to live the life she imagined when she talked about her dreams. Instead, her story ends on that desolate road, her potential unrealized, her voice silenced, her memory kept alive by those who loved her and by the determination to ensure that her life, brief as it was, is remembered for more than just the way it ended. Story 3. The evening of March 4th, 2008, began quietly on the Auburn University campus in Alabama, where students moved between dorms and libraries, their footsteps echoing against old brick buildings that stood like sentinels in the fading light. For 18-year-old Lauren Burke, it was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday, a day of classes, time with her boyfriend, and a study session with a friend at the library. She had no way of knowing that by the time darkness fell completely, her name would become synonymous with tragedy, and that her last act of courage would unfold on a lonely stretch of highway where strangers would struggle to save a life already slipping away. Lauren Ashley Burke was born on August 11, 1989, in Marietta, Georgia, to parents James and Vivian who, though divorced, worked together to give their daughter and her siblings a loving home. She grew up in a world filled with laughter and possibility, the kind of childhood where a girl could dream big and believe those dreams might actually come true. Friends and family described her as radiant, someone whose happiness seemed to spill over into the lives of everyone around her. She had a smile that could light up a room, and an energy that made people want to be near her. At Walton High School in Marietta, Lauren stood out not because she demanded attention, but because her natural warmth and leadership drew people to her. She played lacrosse with passion and dedication, running across fields with the kind of determination that spoke to who she was at her core, someone who gave her all to everything she cared about. Teachers remembered her as responsible and bright, a student who took her education seriously while still managing to enjoy the social aspects of high school life. The principal would later describe her as a great kid and a very good student, words that barely captured the depth of potential she carried. During her time at Walton, Lauren met a boy named Sean, and they began dating in 2006. To Sean, Lauren was nothing short of extraordinary. He would later say that she was the most amazing person he had ever met, someone who changed him in more ways than he could describe. Their relationship was built on genuine affection and mutual respect, the kind of teenage romance that feels both intense and innocent at the same time. After graduating from Walton High in 2007, Lauren set her sights on Auburn University, where she enrolled to study graphic design and art. She had dreams of combining her love for photography with marketing, building a career that would allow her to be creative while also being strategic. Auburn felt like the right place to make those dreams real. She joined the Delta Gamma sorority, where her vibrant personality and contagious smile made her beloved among her sisters. The sorority president would later remark that Lauren touched everyone in a special way, and that her presence made the entire chapter better. But beneath the surface of campus life, beneath the routines of classes and social events and study sessions, danger was circling. On that same campus, a man named Courtney Lockhart was hunting for victims. Courtney Laurel Lockhart was born on October 20th, 1984, and grew up in Smith Station, Alabama, in circumstances far different from Lauren's. His father struggled with drugs and alcohol, and was largely absent from his life. Despite this difficult start, Courtney had been described by friends as outgoing and funny, the kind of person you wanted to be around. But by 2002, something had shifted. He was sent to a juvenile facility for harassment, an early sign that his path was diverging from what might have been. In 2003, 18-year-old Courtney enlisted in the United States Army with dreams of becoming a drill sergeant. He went through basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and was later stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado. From August 2004 to July 2005, he served with the 2nd Brigade Combat Team in Iraq, where he worked as a gunner and performed escort missions while maintaining security at the base. It was a deployment marked by constant danger and loss. His brigade suffered 3 to 4 casualties per week from attacks, and Courtney was forced to endure horrors that would haunt him long after he returned home. He cleaned the interior of a vehicle that contained the remains of a fellow gunner killed in action. He discovered the body of an officer killed by a mortar round while using a bathroom. He witnessed a tank explosion that killed 4 to 5 soldiers after being hit by enemy fire. There were nights when he lay in bed, not knowing if the ceiling would collapse on him from an incoming attack. And perhaps most devastatingly, on June 11, 2005, Sergeant Prince, a man Courtney viewed as a father figure, was killed when his vehicle struck an improvised explosive device. When Courtney returned to the United States in 2005, he was not the same person who had enlisted with hope and ambition. His fiancée Nicole noticed the changes immediately. He was angry, indifferent, and emotionally numb. Though they welcomed a daughter in 2006, Courtney's downward spiral continued. He began drinking heavily and using marijuana. He went AWOL and eventually was court-martialed for threatening and assaulting an officer after an argument in a mess hall escalated. Witnesses said he pulled what appeared to be a pistol and told a female officer he would blow her head off if she didn't back away. In 2006, Courtney was convicted of communicating a threat, marijuana use, and assault. He was sentenced to 7 months in confinement and dishonorably discharged from the Army in December 2006. A mental health evaluation before his discharge found that his mental health was within normal limits, though an Army major would later criticize the evaluation as superficial and lacking proper testing. Back in Smith Station, Courtney struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. His family and friends said he was like a different person, anxious, withdrawn, and unwilling to discuss his time in Iraq. He isolated himself, sometimes locking himself in his room or hiding under his bed. Nicole said he was not in his right mind, that he was unresponsive and paranoid, occasionally lashing out in his sleep or hiding in closets at night. In April 2007, he got a job as a foreman, but loud noises on job sites, like nail guns, distressed him to the point that he once hid behind a truck. By the spring of 2008, Courtney had moved out of his mother's house and was living in his car, neglecting his hygiene and nutrition, surviving on candy bars and soda. During one visit with Nicole and his daughter, he held a gun to his head and threatened suicide. His work performance declined dramatically when the company worked near Fort Benning, where artillery exercises triggered symptoms that left him unable to function. And it was during this period, when Courtney was at his most desperate and unstable, that he began a violent crime spree that would culminate in Lauren Burke's murder. Beginning in February 2008, Courtney committed a string of armed robberies and carjackings in Alabama and Georgia. His methods were consistent and terrifying. He would choose a female victim and approach her from behind as she entered her vehicle in a parking lot, threatening her with a pistol and demanding her purse or attempting to drive away in her car. On February 25th, he robbed a convenience store in Smith Station, firing a shot into the cigarette counter when the clerk said there were no bags available. On March 5th, he robbed a woman in the parking lot of a nursing home in LaGrange, Georgia. On March 6th, he robbed a 27-year-old woman in a Sam's Club parking lot in Columbus, Georgia, compelling her to hand over her purse by pointing a gun at her 3-year-old son's head. On the evening of March 4th, Courtney found himself in need of gas money. Knowing he was not scheduled to work the next day, he decided to rob someone to get money to fill his tank. He drove through the Auburn area for hours, searching for a potential victim, before deciding to head to the Auburn University campus. He parked his silver Chrysler in a lot on a hill, backing into a space to keep his license plate hidden from view, and he sat and watched students coming and going. At one point a police car drove by and frightened him, so he left the area. But he returned later that night, determined to carry out his plan. At around 8 o'clock that evening, Lauren left her boyfriend Sean's dorm and walked toward the Ralph B. Drawn Library, where she planned to meet her friend Michael for a study session. Her black 2001 Honda Civic was parked in a lot near the back. The air was cool, the campus relatively quiet as students prepared for the week ahead. Lauren had no reason to feel afraid. This was her campus, her home away from home, a place where she should have been safe. But as she approached her car and opened the driver's side door, Courtney Lockhart emerged from the shadows. He pointed a Rome RG revolver at her and ordered her into the car. Lauren, terrified, backed into the vehicle and scrambled into the front passenger seat. Courtney got behind the wheel, keeping the gun trained on her. According to his later confession, Lauren was hysterical at first, screaming uncontrollably. Courtney said nothing, simply sat there until she quieted down. Eventually, Lauren handed him $200 in cash and begged him to let her go. But instead of releasing her, Courtney started driving, keeping one hand on the steering wheel and the other pointing the gun at her. As they left campus, Courtney ordered Lauren to take off her clothes. He later claimed that he made her undress not for any sexual purpose, but because he believed she would be less likely to try to escape if she was naked. Lauren refused at first, but under Courtney's persistent demands, she eventually complied. She tried to reason with him, asking repeatedly if he was going to shoot her. She told him that she could help him find a job if it was money he needed. Courtney responded that he had a job and didn't need one, and he began lamenting about how his life was over. For the next 30 minutes, Courtney drove Lauren around the area, passing bars, stores, and downtown restaurants. Lauren's phone began to ring. First it was Michael, her friend who was waiting for her at the library, concerned because she hadn't shown up. Then her boyfriend Sean started calling. Courtney finally agreed to let Lauren answer the phone, but he told her to come up with an excuse for where she was and to get them to stop calling. When Michael called again, Lauren shakily answered and told him that she had forgotten about a birthday dinner for a friend. Before Michael could respond, she hung up the phone. Michael later said he could hear noise in the background that sounded like she was in a car, but he didn't think much of it at the time. As Courtney drove along Alabama Highway 147, Lauren continued trying to reason with him, offering to help him, desperately searching for a way to survive. But Courtney seemed lost in his own despair, talking about how hopeless he felt, how his life was ruined. Then, somewhere between Lee Road 72 and US Highway 280, Lauren made a split-second decision that would define her final moments. She opened the passenger door and leaped from the moving vehicle. As she jumped, Courtney shot her. The bullet entered the back of her left shoulder at close range, pierced both of her lungs, and exited through her upper right arm. Courtney later claimed the gun went off accidentally, that both he and Lauren were shocked by the sound. Prosecutors would argue, and a jury would later agree, that he intentionally shot her. Witnesses reported hearing 2 shots and seeing a naked young woman jumping from the vehicle. Courtney fled, leaving Lauren on Alabama State Route 147, naked except for a pair of socks, crying, and covered in road rash and abrasions from the fall. Despite being gravely injured and bleeding heavily, Lauren stumbled to her feet and waved her arms frantically, trying to flag down help. 2 separate motorists saw her and immediately turned their vehicles around, blocking traffic from both directions. But by the time they reached her, Lauren was lying on her back in the middle of the road, gasping for air and slipping out of consciousness. Someone called 911 at around 9 o'clock. Police arrived at 9:12 and attempted CPR, but Lauren had no pulse. Paramedics transported her to East Alabama Medical Center, where she arrived at 9:35. Shortly thereafter, she was pronounced dead. Doctors said she bled to death from the gunshot wound. While Lauren was fighting for her life on that highway, Courtney was executing a plan to cover his tracks. He stopped at a Chevron gas station on North College Street and used Lauren's stolen credit card to purchase gasoline at 9:17, just minutes after she had been found on the road. He used the gas to douse the inside of Lauren's car, then drove to the Hinton Field parking lot near the Auburn University band practice field. He attempted to set the car on fire, but was unsuccessful at first because his lighter wouldn't spark. He went to his own car and got a Burger King bag to use as a fire starter. This time the fire took hold. Before leaving, Courtney took $46 from the $200 Lauren had given him earlier, along with her iPod and credit card. He left her clothing, the rest of her cash, and her digital camera in the burning car. Satisfied that the car was engulfed in flames, Courtney fled north on Interstate 85 to Atlanta, Georgia, where he used Lauren's credit card to buy more gas. He used it again at a Kroger in LaGrange, Georgia, before throwing it out the window. At around 9:30 that night, police and firefighters responded to a call about a car on fire on Auburn's campus. After extinguishing the flames, investigators recovered a .38 caliber bullet under the driver's seat. They ran the car's registration and found it was owned by James Burke. After receiving a call from police, Lauren's father began frantically calling his daughter's friends to locate her. Then he drove to Auburn, his heart heavy with dread, and identified his daughter's body at the hospital. He would later say it looked like she was sleeping like an angel, and that all he could do was kiss her forehead and whisper the words, "Oh my God." For 3 days, investigators worked around the clock to identify Lauren's killer. They traced her credit card usage and obtained surveillance footage from the Chevron station, showing a man using her card. With help from NASA, they enhanced the image and intensified the search for the unidentified man. On March 7th, 3 days after Lauren's murder, police in Noonan, Georgia responded to a call about a carjacking in the parking lot of a Walmart. Witnesses saw a man with a gun attacking a 72-year-old woman named Marjorie as she was getting into her car. He struck her on the back of the head, held a gun to her head, and shoved her onto the passenger side floorboard before attempting to flee in her car. A bystander named Scott followed the suspect in his own vehicle until the man stopped, abandoned Marjorie's car, and fled in a silver Chrysler. Walmart's loss prevention team provided surveillance footage showing the license plate number, which led investigators to identify the suspect as Courtney Lockhart. About 30 minutes later, Officer Williams of the Phoenix City Alabama Police Department spotted the Chrysler speeding through a construction zone on Highway 80. He pulled Courtney over and issued citations for speeding and lack of insurance. When he ran Courtney's information, he learned that investigators wanted to speak with him. Williams asked Courtney to step out of the vehicle and wait at the back until other officers arrived. When they did, Courtney suddenly resisted arrest, broke free, and took off in his car, initiating a high-speed chase that reached 80 miles per hour. The pursuit was chaotic, with Courtney veering off the road multiple times. Near Glenwood School, he suddenly stopped the Chrysler and opened the driver's side door, causing Officer Richards, who was on a motorcycle, to crash into it. Richards flew over the handlebars and onto the pavement. Courtney jumped out of the car and ran into the woods. Despite being injured, Officer Richards managed to stand up and chase Courtney for about 40 yards before having to stop, but he was able to point other officers in the right direction. They found Courtney and apprehended him without further incident. He had a revolver and an iPod on him. As he was being led out of the woods, Courtney said, "I'm sorry. I tried to get help after coming back from Iraq." During interrogation, Courtney confessed to Lauren's murder and to the string of robberies he had committed in the days leading up to his arrest. He broke down and said he never intended to kill or sexually assault Lauren, that his goal was simply another robbery. He described in detail how he had stalked the Auburn campus, how he had confronted Lauren, forced her into the car, made her undress, and driven her around while lamenting about his life. He claimed the gun went off accidentally when Lauren jumped from the car. Forensic analysis told a different story. Ballistics testing confirmed that the bullet found in Lauren's car and the shell casings in Courtney's vehicle were fired from his revolver. Firearms experts debunked the idea of an accidental discharge, proving that the revolver was functioning properly and required significant pressure on the trigger to fire. Courtney, who had been trained to handle firearms in the military and served as a gunner, would have known this. Courtney Lockhart's trial began on November 8, 2010, more than 2 years after Lauren's murder. Prosecutors argued that he had kidnapped and attempted to rape Lauren, then intentionally shot her when she tried to escape. They relied heavily on his own detailed confession, forensic evidence, and ballistics reports. They showed that Courtney had carefully planned his actions by staking out a location, concealing his license plate, and attempting to destroy evidence by setting Lauren's car on fire. The defense countered with claims of insanity, arguing that Courtney suffered from debilitating mental health issues, including PTSD from his service in Iraq, and that these conditions impaired his ability to make decisions. But forensic psychologist Dr. Glenn King testified that there was no evidence to support that Courtney had PTSD or any other mental illness. He noted that Courtney had never received treatment, never taken medications, never been hospitalized, and never sought or received any consultation or diagnosis regarding PTSD. Dr. King stated that Courtney's actions were deliberate, premeditated, planned, and organized, and that he had a definite motive to avoid apprehension. After 6.5 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury found Courtney Lockhart guilty of capital murder committed during a robbery and kidnapping. He was acquitted of capital murder in the course of an attempted rape. During the penalty phase, the jury unanimously recommended that Courtney be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But in Alabama, judges have the power to override jury sentencing recommendations. On March 2, 2011, Judge Jacob Walker sentenced Courtney Lockhart to death by lethal injection. Judge Walker cited Courtney's criminal history, including the crime spree and negative conduct while in the military, which the jury had not been fully aware of. He concluded that had the jury known these additional facts, their sentencing recommendation would likely have differed. Walker also emphasized the egregious nature of the kidnapping, noting that Lauren was alone, unarmed, and chosen at random from a college campus, a place where students should feel safe. He described how Courtney forced her to undress and held her at gunpoint to prevent her escape. Courtney Lockhart appealed his conviction and death sentence multiple times. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction and death sentence in August 2013, stating that the sentence was not imposed under the influence of passion, prejudice, or any other arbitrary factor, and that it was neither disproportionate nor excessive. The Supreme Court of Alabama denied his petition in September 2014, and the United States Supreme Court denied his petition in April 2015. As of 2022, Courtney Lockhart remains on death row at the Holman Correctional Facility in Escambia County, Alabama. Lauren Burke's parents have been strong supporters of the death sentence. Her mother said at a hearing in 2018, "He didn't give her a second chance. He shouldn't get a second chance either." Her father said at another hearing in 2019, "We maintain our desire for the death penalty. Lauren did get the death penalty without a hearing, and we will do anything it takes to continue this process." Her body was cremated and brought back to her home in Marietta, Georgia. Her family filed a claim against Auburn University, arguing that the decision to merge the university's police force with the city police force led to inadequate security, but Alabama's Board of Adjustment denied the claim in November 2014. In the years since Lauren's death, her story has been told and retold as a reminder of how quickly safety can be shattered, how a moment of ordinary routine, walking to your car on a college campus, can become the threshold of unimaginable terror. But more than that, Lauren's story is about courage. In her final moments, when most people would have frozen in fear or surrendered to despair, she chose to fight for her life. She leaped from a moving car, risking everything in a desperate bid for freedom. And even after being shot, even as her life bled away on that cold highway, she stood up and waved her arms, calling for help, refusing to give up until her body simply could not continue. Lauren Burke was 18 years old when she died, a freshman with dreams of photography and marketing, a young woman who loved her sorority sisters and her boyfriend, who played lacrosse with passion and smiled with a radiance that people remembered long after she was gone. She should have graduated, built a career, fallen in love, raised a family, grown old. Instead, her life was stolen by a stranger on a dark road, and all that remains is the memory of her courage, the grief of those who loved her, and the determination to ensure that her name means more than just the way she died. Story 4. The neon lights of Club 616 flickered against the humid night air of Lantana, Florida, on November 7, 1997, casting a glow that spilled onto the cracked pavement of the parking lot. Inside, the bar pulsed with the rhythm of a jukebox, the clink of glasses, and the low hum of conversation. William Earl Molt, a 40-year-old mortgage broker known to his friends as Bill, sat at a corner table, nursing a drink. He was a quiet man, not one for the nightlife, but tonight he had ventured out, seeking a break from the routine of his suburban life. His sandy hair caught the dim light, and his reserved demeanor set him apart from the boisterous crowd. At 9:30 p.m., he picked up his phone, his fingers steady despite the drinks he'd had, and called his girlfriend, Cheryl. "I'll be home soon," he said, his voice calm, reassuring. She smiled through the phone, picturing him in his white 1994 Saturn SL, winding through the familiar streets of Lantana. But as the clock ticked past 11 p.m., and Bill's car never pulled into the driveway, a quiet unease began to settle over Cheryl's heart. Bill Molt, a man who lived a life of quiet predictability, had vanished into the night. Bill's life was one of steady, unassuming routine. Born in 1957, he grew up in Brooklyn, New York, before moving to Florida in his 20s, drawn by the promise of warm winters and new opportunities. He settled in Lantana, a small coastal town where palm trees swayed against the backdrop of strip malls and quiet neighborhoods. As a mortgage broker, Bill was meticulous, his days spent poring over paperwork, helping families secure their slice of the American dream. He wasn't flashy. His wardrobe consisted of khakis and polo shirts, his car a practical sedan. But he was reliable, the kind of man who always called when he said he would. He shared a modest home with Cheryl, their relationship a steady anchor in a world that could feel chaotic. They weren't married, but their bond was deep, built on shared evenings watching TV and planning for a future that seemed just within reach. Bill had no enemies, no dark secrets, at least none that anyone knew. To those who loved him, his disappearance was not just a mystery, but an impossibility. The morning of November 8th, 1997, dawned with a heavy stillness. Cheryl woke to an empty bed, her worry from the night before now a gnawing panic. She called Bill's phone, but it rang unanswered, the sound echoing in her ears like a warning. She contacted his family, his brother Robert and sister Linda, who lived nearby, and together they retraced his steps. The staff at Club 616 confirmed what Cheryl already knew. Bill had been there, quiet as always, sipping a few drinks but showing no signs of intoxication. He left alone around 11 p.m., climbing into his Saturn, the engine humming as he pulled out of the lot. No one saw anything unusual, no arguments, no suspicious figures lurking in the shadows. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole, car and all. By midday, Cheryl and Bill's family reported him missing to the Lantana Police Department. Officer Maria Delgado, a young but determined detective, took the initial report, her pen moving quickly as she noted the details. 40 years old, 5 feet 10 inches, medium build, last seen driving a white Saturn SL. She visited Club 616, interviewing bartenders and patrons, but their stories were consistent. Bill was unremarkable, a man who kept to himself. Delgado drove the route from the club to Bill's home, a 15-minute stretch along Lantana Road, scanning for any sign of a crash or abandoned vehicle. The roads were clear, the ditches empty. She called in a helicopter unit to sweep the area from above, their blades slicing through the humid air as they searched canals and wooded lots. Nothing. The case, barely a day old, was already slipping toward the cold, unyielding grip of the unknown. For Cheryl, the days that followed were a blur of anguish and action. She plastered missing person flyers across Lantana, Bill's face smiling back from telephone poles and storefront windows. His photo, taken at a family barbecue the previous summer, showed a man with kind eyes and a shy smile, his arm around Cheryl. Missing, William Earl Molt, the flyers read, listing his height, weight, and the details of his car. Friends and neighbors joined the effort, combing fields and checking local businesses, their footsteps heavy with hope that faded with each passing hour. Robert, Bill's older brother, took to knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a white Saturn or heard anything unusual that night. Linda, his sister, sat with Cheryl at night, the two women clutching coffee mugs as they tried to make sense of the impossible. "He wouldn't just leave," Cheryl said, her voice breaking. "Something happened to him." The Lantana police, under pressure from a community rattled by the disappearance, expanded their investigation. Delgado and her partner, Detective James Carter, considered every possibility. Was Bill the victim of a robbery gone wrong? There was no evidence of a struggle, no blood or debris at the club's parking lot. Had he chosen to disappear, overwhelmed by some unseen pressure? His bank accounts showed no unusual activity, and his personal life, by all accounts, was stable. Carter suggested a car accident, a plausible scenario given the dark, winding roads around Lantana. But searches of nearby highways, canals, and retention ponds, common in Florida's low-lying landscape, yielded nothing. The police checked hospitals, jails, even homeless shelters, but Bill's name appeared nowhere. The case began to cool, the initial urgency giving way to the slow grind of an unsolved mystery. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. The world moved on, but for Cheryl and the Molt family, time stood still. They held vigils on the anniversary of Bill's disappearance, gathering at a local church where candles flickered against the evening sky. Cheryl kept Bill's belongings untouched, his favorite jacket hanging in the closet, his paperwork stacked neatly on his desk, as if preserving them might somehow bring him back. She visited a psychic once, desperate for answers, but the vague promises of closure only deepened her frustration. The media, initially eager to cover the story, moved on to other tragedies, leaving Bill's case to fade into the archives. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System listed him as case number MP20695, a sterile designation that belied the human toll of his absence. In the years that followed, Lantana changed. The small town grew, its quiet streets giving way to new developments and bustling subdivisions. The Grand Isles, a housing community in nearby Wellington, about 20 miles from Lantana, sprang up in the late 1990s, its manicured lawns and modern homes a symbol of Florida's booming real estate market. A retention pond, dug to manage stormwater, sat at the edge of the neighborhood, its murky waters reflecting the sky. No one paid it much attention. It was just another feature of the suburban landscape, a place where children tossed stones and egrets waded in the shallows. But beneath its surface, hidden from view, lay a secret that would remain buried for over 2 decades. The breakthrough came in August 2019, in a way that seemed almost too surreal to be true. Barry Fay, a 50-year-old resident of the Grand Isles, was at home one evening when he received a call from a former neighbor, a man who had moved away years earlier. The former neighbor, idly browsing Google Earth to reminisce about his old home, had zoomed in on the retention pond at Moon Bay Circle. There, in the satellite imagery, was something unmistakable. The outline of a car, its white roof barely visible beneath the water's surface. "You should check it out," he told Fay, his voice tinged with curiosity. Fay, skeptical but intrigued, borrowed a drone from a friend and flew it over the pond. The drone's camera confirmed it, a vehicle submerged and calcified, its shape eerily clear against the muddy bottom. Fay's heart sank as he dialed the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, unaware that he was about to unravel a mystery that had haunted a family for 22 years. On August 28, 2019, deputies arrived at Moon Bay Circle, their vehicles lining the quiet street as curious neighbors gathered. A dive team suited up, their equipment clanking as they descended into the pond's murky depths. The water was thick with sediment, visibility near zero, but the divers worked methodically, their hands probing the mud until they felt the hard edge of a car. It was a 1994 Saturn SL, its once white exterior now encrusted with algae and corrosion. As the tow truck pulled the vehicle from the water, its frame groaned, water pouring from its shattered windows. Inside, the divers found skeletal remains, the bones brittle and weathered by years underwater. The discovery sent a chill through the crowd, and for Cheryl, who was notified by phone, it was a moment of both closure and renewed grief. "I knew he didn't leave me," she whispered to Linda, tears streaming down her face. The Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's office took over, using dental records to confirm what everyone suspected. The remains were those of William Earl Molt. The car matched the description of Bill's Saturn, and the location, though 20 miles from Lantana, was plausible given the route he might have taken that night. The Grand Isles had been under construction in 1997, its roads unpaved and poorly lit, the retention pond a new feature with no barriers or signs to warn drivers. Sheriff spokesperson Terry Barbera spoke to the press, her voice measured but somber. "We believe he lost control of his vehicle and drove into the pond," she said, citing the lack of evidence for foul play. "The exact circumstances may never be known, but he's been found." The explanation was simple, almost painfully so, a tragic accident, a moment of misjudgment in the dark, and a life lost to the unforgiving waters. The discovery was both a resolution and a revelation. The car had been visible on Google Earth since at least 2007, its image captured in satellite photos that anyone could access. Yet, for 12 years, it had gone unnoticed, a silent testament to the limits of human observation. The former neighbor's chance discovery, prompted by nostalgia, had done what years of police searches could not. The story made headlines, from the BBC to the Washington Post, with outlets marveling at the role of technology in solving a decades-old mystery. The Charlie Project, an online database of missing persons, updated Bill's profile to Resolved, noting the eerie fact that his car had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. "It's heartbreaking," Cheryl told a reporter from the Palm Beach Post, her voice heavy with the weight of 22 years. "He was right there, and we didn't know." For the Molt family, the discovery brought answers, but also new questions. How had Bill ended up in Wellington, so far from his usual route? Had he taken a wrong turn, disoriented by the drinks or the unfamiliar roads? The police found no evidence of intoxication beyond the few drinks he'd had, and witnesses at the club insisted he seemed sober when he left. Some speculated that the construction in the Grand Isles, with its unmarked roads and open lots, had confused him, leading him to the pond's edge. Others wondered if he'd been distracted, perhaps by a phone call or a moment of fatigue. The lack of skid marks or defensive damage to the car suggested he hadn't tried to stop, a detail that haunted Cheryl. "Did he even know what was happening?" she asked Robert one night, her voice barely audible. The community of Lantana, too, was shaken by the news. Neighbors who had known Bill gathered at a local diner, sharing memories of a man who was kind but reserved, always quick with a smile. The Grand Isles residents, many of whom had lived there for years, were stunned to learn a car had been in their pond all along. Lori Martin, who lived across from the pond, spoke to ABC 11, her voice tinged with disbelief. "They came knocking on our door and asked how long we'd been here," she said. "We told them 9 years, and they said, 'Did you know there was a car in the lake?'" The revelation sparked conversations about the unseen dangers of retention ponds, common in Florida but rarely secured, and the power of technology to uncover what human eyes had missed. Cheryl and the Molt family held a small memorial for Bill in September 2019, a quiet gathering at the church where they had once held vigils. They scattered his ashes in the Atlantic Ocean, the waves lapping gently as Cheryl spoke of his love for the sea. "He's at peace now," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. The closure was bittersweet, a resolution that came too late to heal the years of pain, but offered a chance to move forward. Cheryl kept one of Bill's flyers, its edges worn from years of handling, as a reminder of the man she'd loved and the mystery that had defined her life for so long. The case of William Earl Molt became a touchstone for discussions about missing persons and the role of technology in solving cold cases. Groups like Adventures with Purpose, a YouTube channel dedicated to finding submerged vehicles, cited Bill's case as an example of how sonar and drones could aid investigations. The story also highlighted the challenges of searching Florida's waterways, where murky ponds and shifting water levels could hide evidence for decades. For Detective Delgado, now a seasoned investigator, the case was a reminder of the limits of her early efforts. "We looked everywhere we could," she told a colleague, her voice heavy with regret. "But sometimes the answers are just out of reach." The retention pond at Moon Bay Circle is still there, its surface calm, its secrets now revealed. The Grand Isles has grown, its homes filled with families who know little of the tragedy that unfolded before their neighborhood existed. But for those who loved Bill Molt, the pond is a place of quiet reverence, a marker of a life lost and a mystery solved. Cheryl visits sometimes, standing at the water's edge, her thoughts drifting to that November night. She imagines Bill's car slipping into the darkness, the water closing over it, and wonders what he felt in those final moments. The answers may never come, but the truth, uncovered by a chance glance at a satellite image, has given her a measure of peace, a fragile gift after 22 years of waiting. Story 5. The Stewart Highway cuts through the heart of Australia's Northern Territory, like a ribbon of asphalt stretched across an endless canvas of red earth and scrubby desert. During the day, the landscape shimmers under a relentless sun, and at night, darkness descends so completely that the stars seem to press down from above, close enough to touch. In July 2001, this remote highway became the setting for one of Australia's most haunting mysteries, a case that would captivate two nations and leave a family forever searching for answers. Peter Marco Falconio was born in 1972 in Hepworth, West Yorkshire, England, the third of 4 sons in a close-knit family. He grew up with the kind of curiosity that transforms ordinary childhoods into collections of adventures, always seeking the next horizon. When he enrolled at Brighton University in 1996 to pursue his studies, he could not have known that a chance encounter at a nightclub would change the trajectory of his life. It was there, amid the pulse of music and the swirl of conversation, that he met Joanne Rachel Lees, a young woman born in September 1973, who shared his appetite for exploration. They connected immediately, and soon they were living together, building a life that revolved around shared dreams of travel and discovery. Their friends would later describe them as inseparable, a couple whose plans always seemed to extend beyond the immediate future, reaching toward distant lands and unknown experiences. In 2000, Peter and Joanne embarked on the journey they had been planning for years, a backpacking odyssey across Asia. They traveled through Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Nepal, and Cambodia, immersing themselves in cultures vastly different from their own, collecting memories in dusty markets and mountain villages. Their families watched with a mixture of pride and concern, especially when the couple announced the final leg of their journey, Australia. The news of backpacker murders and the Port Arthur massacre had reached England, casting a shadow over Australia's reputation as a safe destination for travelers. Peter's parents and Joanne's family urged caution, but the couple was undeterred. In January 2001, they arrived in Australia on working holiday visas, permits that allowed them to supplement their travel funds with employment as they explored the vast continent. For the first 6 months, Peter and Joanne worked and traveled, gradually making their way around the country. They fell into the rhythm that many backpackers know well, working just enough to fund the next adventure, sleeping in hostels and camper vans, meeting fellow travelers from around the world. By late June, they had purchased an orange Volkswagen Combi van, a classic choice for budget travelers, and planned an ambitious road trip that would take them from Sydney through Canberra, Melbourne, Adelaide, and up to Darwin, before looping back through Brisbane. On July 14, 2001, Peter and Joanne found themselves on the Stuart Highway, heading north toward the Devil's Marbles Conservation Reserve, a striking landscape of massive granite boulders scattered across the red earth. They had set out late, ignoring the advice of locals who warned against traveling the remote highway after dark. The highway stretched for hundreds of kilometers with almost nothing in between. No towns, no services, just the occasional roadhouse clinging to existence in the vast emptiness. The town of Barrow Creek, situated about 280 kilometers north of Alice Springs, was little more than a fuel stop and a pub, the only sign of civilization for miles in either direction. As evening descended and darkness swallowed the landscape, Peter was at the wheel of the Combi, with Joanne beside him. The headlights carved a tunnel through the blackness, revealing nothing but the white lines of the highway and the occasional kangaroo frozen at the roadside. Around 7:30 in the evening, Joanne noticed headlights in the rearview mirror. A vehicle had been following them for some time, maintaining a steady distance behind their van. Then, without warning, the driver began flashing his lights and gesturing for them to pull over. The man behind the wheel appeared to be signaling that something was wrong with their vehicle. Engine trouble, perhaps. Peter slowed the Combi and pulled to the side of the highway. The other vehicle, a four-wheel drive truck, pulled up behind them. A man stepped out and approached the driver's window. He was unremarkable in appearance, his manner initially seeming helpful as he explained that he had noticed sparks or smoke coming from their exhaust. Peter, concerned about the van's condition, agreed to check the engine. What happened next would be recounted later only through Joanne's testimony, as she became the sole witness to the events that followed. As Peter walked toward the rear of the van with the stranger, Joanne moved into the driver's seat, ready to rev the engine if needed to help diagnose the problem. She sat there in the gathering darkness, hands on the steering wheel, waiting for Peter's signal. Instead of an engine's roar, the night was shattered by a sound that Joanne would never forget, a loud bang that echoed across the empty desert. Before she could process what she had heard, the stranger appeared at her window, no longer the helpful motorist but a figure of menace, brandishing a silver handgun. Terror crystallized into action as Joanne realized the danger she faced. The man climbed into the van, and Joanne, understanding that resistance might mean death, allowed him to secure her hands behind her back with black cable ties. But when he attempted to bind her feet and tape her mouth, something inside her refused to surrender completely. She fought against the restraints, her body twisting and struggling even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. The man dragged her toward his vehicle, and in that moment, Joanne caught sight of a dog in the truck, a detail that would later become part of the investigation. But more pressing than any detail was the growing certainty of what would happen if she remained in his control. The gunman seemed distracted, apparently occupied with moving something, or someone, and Joanne seized the moment. With her hands still bound behind her, she fled into the darkness of the Australian outback. The terrain was hostile, filled with Spinifex grass that scratched at her skin and unseen obstacles that threatened to trip her with every step. Behind her, she could hear the man searching, his footsteps crunching on the red earth, his torch beam sweeping through the night. 3 times he passed close to where she hid, crouched beneath the sparse cover of desert bushes, her breath coming in ragged gasps that she struggled to silence. For 5 hours, Joanne remained hidden in the bush, not knowing if the man was still searching or if he had given up and driven away. The desert night was cold, a stark contrast to the scorching days, and she shivered in the darkness, every sound magnified by fear and isolation. She thought of Peter, of the gunshot she had heard, and tried not to imagine what it meant. Finally, when she could no longer hear any sign of her attacker, Joanne emerged from her hiding place and stumbled toward the highway. At 12:35 in the morning, nearly 5 hours after the attack began, she saw headlights approaching and threw herself into the road, waving her arms frantically. The vehicle was a road train, one of the massive trucks that hauled goods across the vast distances of the Australian interior. The driver and his co-driver stopped, and Joanne, still bound by the cable ties, poured out her story in broken fragments. The truck drivers freed her hands and drove her back to Barrow Creek, where they contacted the authorities. Within hours, police arrived at the scene, and the machinery of one of Australia's most intensive investigations began to turn. When police examined the site where Peter and Joanne had been stopped, they found blood on the road surface near where the van had been parked. The discovery confirmed Joanne's account of hearing a gunshot and suggested that Peter had been seriously injured or killed. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding area, no body was found, and no trace of Peter Falconio emerged from the thousands of square kilometers of desert. The investigation, designated Task Force Regulus, became one of the most exhaustive police operations ever mounted in Australia. Officers worked around the clock, following up on hundreds of leads and interviewing more than 600 individuals who were considered persons of interest. Forensic scientists labored through 14-hour shifts, examining every piece of physical evidence that might yield a clue. Among the most critical pieces of evidence were the cable ties that had bound Joanne's wrists and a tiny smudge of DNA found on her t-shirt. The DNA profile did not match Peter, Joanne, any of the investigators, or her rescuers, suggesting it belonged to the attacker. This genetic fingerprint became the cornerstone of the investigation, a scientific beacon that investigators hoped would lead them to the perpetrator. Media coverage of the case was intense, both in Australia and the United Kingdom. Joanne found herself under scrutiny not just as a witness, but as a suspect in the early stages, as investigators worked to verify her account and rule out alternative explanations. The pressure was immense, and details of her personal life, including an affair she had been having with another man during the trip, were exposed to public examination. These revelations complicated the narrative and led some to question her credibility, though they did not ultimately undermine the physical evidence or her core testimony. For months, the investigation seemed to stall. Leads were pursued and exhausted. Witnesses came forward with sightings that proved false, and the DNA profile remained unmatched. Then, in November 2001, police interviewed a man named Bradley John Murdoch in Broome, Western Australia. At the time, Joanne's descriptions of the attacker did not immediately connect the case to Murdoch, and crucially, no DNA sample was collected during that initial interview. Bradley John Murdoch was born on February 19, 1958, and by 2001, he had accumulated a troubling criminal history. In 1980, at the age of 21, he had received a suspended sentence for causing death by dangerous driving after hitting and killing a motorcyclist. In 1995, He had been imprisoned for 21 months for a drunken incident in which he fired a gun at people celebrating at an indigenous Australian football match in the remote Kimberley region. He was released after serving 15 months. By the late 1990s, Murdoch was working as a truck driver and illicit drug smuggler, admitting in later court proceedings to transporting large quantities of cannabis across the vast distances of the Australian interior. He had developed white supremacist tendencies and bore a racist tattoo, markers of an ideology that sat alongside his criminal activities. He lived in Broome and made regular runs to South Australia, traveling the same remote highways where Peter and Joanne had been attacked. The breakthrough came in May 2002, when investigators apprehended Murdoch's drug-running accomplice, James Heppy. Facing serious marijuana charges himself, Heppy began providing details that connected Murdoch to the Falconio case. He told police that Murdoch had confessed to killing Peter and had shown him a pistol. Heppy also provided clothing and cigarette butts that belonged to Murdoch, items that could be tested for DNA. When the DNA from Murdoch's brother was examined, a method that could indicate familial connection, the results supported Murdoch's involvement. The circle was tightening, but Murdoch had disappeared. For months, he evaded capture until August 22, 2002, when South Australia police arrested him on unrelated kidnapping and assault charges. He was subsequently charged with the murder of Peter Falconio and the assault and attempted kidnapping of Joanne Lees. The trial of Bradley John Murdoch began on October 17, 2005, before the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory in Darwin. To accommodate the massive media attention and the logistical demands of the proceedings, the Darwin courthouse underwent renovations costing $900,000 Australian dollars. The Chief Justice of the Northern Territory, Brian Ross Martin, presided over the case. Murdoch pleaded not guilty to all charges. The prosecution, led by Rex Wild, presented a case built on DNA evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial details that collectively painted a damning picture. Central to the case was Joanne Lees, who took the stand and identified Murdoch as her attacker, first from police photographs shown to her in November 2002 and then face-to-face during the trial. Joanne recounted the terror of that night, how the man had tied her wrists with cable ties, put a sack over her head, and forced her into his vehicle. She described her escape into the darkness and the hours she spent hiding while Murdoch searched for her with a torch. An Aboriginal tracker named Teddy Egan, who had been involved in the search for Peter, testified that the evidence in the bush confirmed Joanne's account of hiding there. The DNA evidence was compelling, but not without complications. Forensic scientist Carmen Eckhoff testified about the testing of the cable ties and the T-shirt, acknowledging that contamination issues had arisen during the investigation. The director of Forensic Services DNA had been found on one of the cable tie samples, raising questions about evidence handling. Additionally, there were gaps in the chain of custody for some evidence items. Despite these concerns, the DNA profile found on Joanne's shirt remained a powerful link to Murdoch. Perhaps one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence was a hair elastic found tied around Murdoch's gun holster. Lead investigator Colleen Gwynn later remarked that she believed it was kept as a trophy, though the true significance would never be confirmed. The defense challenged various aspects of the prosecution's case, pointing to eyewitness accounts that claimed to have seen Peter Falconio at a petrol station 1 week after his disappearance. Prosecutor Rex Wild dismissed these sightings, noting that each account gave conflicting information, particularly about hair color, and that police had followed up on all such reports without finding any credible evidence. The question of Peter's body loomed over the entire trial. Despite one of the most exhaustive searches ever conducted in Australia, no trace of him had been found. The prosecution suggested that Murdoch had likely disposed of the body somewhere in the vast, remote stretch between Alice Springs and Broome, a distance of nearly 1,600 kilometers of harsh, unforgiving landscape. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached their verdict on December 13, 2005. They found Bradley John Murdoch guilty of murdering Peter Falconio and guilty of assault and attempted kidnapping of Joan Lees. The verdict was unanimous. Murdoch was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 28 years. Only after sentencing was it revealed that Murdoch had previously been acquitted of aggravated sexual assault charges involving a mother and daughter in South Australia. The revelation added another layer of darkness to an already disturbing profile. Murdoch immediately began the appeals process, challenging his conviction through multiple legal avenues. He appealed to the Northern Territory Court of Criminal Appeal and later applied for special leave to appeal to the High Court of Australia. On June 21, 2007, the High Court refused to grant special leave, effectively exhausting all of Murdoch's legal options under the Australian judicial system. He launched another appeal in 2013, but it too was unsuccessful. Throughout all of this, Murdoch maintained his innocence and refused to reveal the location of Peter Falconio's body. This silence became a source of ongoing anguish for Peter's family, who were denied even the closure of being able to lay their loved one to rest. In 2016, the Northern Territory enacted legislation known as the No Body, No Parole Law. The law stipulated that Murdoch would not be eligible for parole when his non-parole period ended in 2032 unless he disclosed the location of Peter's remains. The legislation was designed to provide families with leverage in cases where convicted murderers refused to reveal what they had done with their victims' bodies. For Joan Lees, the years following the trial brought a mixture of vindication and continued scrutiny. She wrote a book about her experiences and saw her story adapted into a television film. In 2017, she returned to the scene of the attack, a journey that must have required immense courage. The trauma of that night in July 2001 had irrevocably altered the course of her life, leaving scars both visible and hidden. The case had a profound impact on the community of Central Australia as well. The murder of a foreign tourist on one of the country's major highways reinforced fears about safety in the remote outback and affected tourism in the region. The Stuart Highway, already known for its isolation and harsh conditions, gained a darker reputation. On July 15, 2025, Bradley John Murdoch died from throat cancer while incarcerated at Darwin Correctional Center. He was 67 years old. His death brought an end to his life sentence, but also meant that the location of Peter Falconio's body would likely never be known. The secret died with him, leaving the Falconio family without the answers they had sought for nearly a quarter of a century. To this day, Peter Falconio's body has never been recovered. The red earth of the Australian outback has kept it secret, and the vast distances and harsh terrain make it unlikely that remains will ever be found without specific knowledge of where to search. Peter's family has had to live with the painful reality that their son, brother, and loved one disappeared into the desert and never returned. The case remains one of Australia's most famous and troubling criminal investigations, a story that captured international attention and refused to fade from public consciousness. It speaks to fundamental fears about travel, trust, and the vulnerability that comes with venturing into remote places. Peter and Joanne were young people living their dream of adventure, and in one terrible moment on a dark highway, that dream was shattered. The orange Volkswagen Combi that carried them north toward the Devil's Marbles became a symbol of the case, a reminder of the ordinary circumstances that preceded an extraordinary horror. The cable ties, the DNA evidence, the hours Joanne spent hiding in the bush, all of these details coalesced into a narrative that was at once specific and universal, a story about survival and loss that resonated far beyond the borders of Australia. For those who knew Peter Falconio, he was more than a victim or a headline. He was a son who loved adventure, a partner who dreamed of exploring the world, a young man whose life was full of promise and possibility. His disappearance left a void that could never be filled, a collection of unanswered questions and unfinished stories. Joan Lees, too, became a symbol of survival, of resilience, of the strength required to escape terror and then live with its aftermath. Her testimony was crucial in bringing Murdoch to justice, and her willingness to face her attacker in court demonstrated a courage that many could only imagine. The scrutiny she endured, both during the investigation and in the years that followed, added another dimension of suffering to an already traumatic experience. The Stewart Highway continues to stretch across the Northern Territory, carrying travelers between Alice Springs and Darwin through some of the most remote and beautiful landscape on Earth. Road trains still rumble along its length, and tourists still venture into the outback seeking adventure and solitude. But for those who remember the case of Peter Falconio, the highway will forever be marked by what happened there on a July night in 2001. The desert keeps its secrets well, and somewhere in that vast expanse of red earth and Spinifex grass, Peter Falconio remains. His story is a reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places, that danger can wear the mask of helpfulness, and that some wounds never fully heal. The case stands as a testament to the dedication of investigators who pursued justice across years and vast distances, to the courage of a survivor who refused to let terror silence her, and to a family who continues to grieve for a son who never came home. In the end, the Peter Falconio case is not just a story of murder and conviction, but a human tragedy that rippled across continents and lives, leaving scars that time has not erased. It is a reminder that behind every headline is a person, a life lived and lost, and families left to navigate a world forever changed by absence. Story 6. The Dazals Winelands Golf Estate lies nestled between the Blocklippen River and the majestic Stellenbosch Mountains in South Africa's Western Cape, a place where vineyards stretch toward distant peaks and luxury homes overlook emerald fairways. The estate represents the pinnacle of comfortable living, where successful families settle to enjoy lives of quiet prosperity and stunning natural beauty. In January 2015, this tranquil sanctuary became the scene of one of South Africa's most shocking and heartbreaking crimes, a nightmare that would expose the darkest possibilities of human nature and shatter the illusion of safety that wealth and privilege provide. Martin van Breda was a man who understood success. Born in South Africa, he had built an impressive business empire spanning property development and education, with directorships in at least 25 companies and ownership of a string of private schools. He was 54 years old in 2015, a devoted husband to his wife Teresa, who was 55, and a proud father to 3 children who represented the future he had worked so hard to secure. Their eldest son, Rudy, was 22 years old, a bright young man who had been accepted to pursue a master's degree in engineering at the prestigious Melbourne University. He embodied the promise of the next generation, intelligent and ambitious, with his whole life stretching before him. The youngest son, Henri, was 20 years old in January 2015, a young man still finding his way in the world. Their daughter, Marley, was 16, navigating the complex terrain of adolescence with the support of her close-knit family. The family's journey had taken them far from South Africa. In late 2005, they had relocated to Australia, settling first in Perth, Western Australia, where Martin quickly established a successful property development business. The family integrated into the tight-knit expatriate community, building friendships within the Protea social circle that connected South Africans living abroad. The boys, Rudy and Henri, both attended Scotch College, an elite institution in the leafy suburb of Claremont, while young Marley enrolled at the exclusive Presbyterian Ladies' College. For approximately 7 years, the Van Bredas built a life in Perth, a world away from their South African roots. In late 2012, another business opportunity prompted them to move to Queensland's Sunshine Coast, where Martin continued his work in real estate while staying close to his sons, who were both studying at universities in Melbourne. But by January 2014, the pull of home proved too strong, and the family made the decision to return to South Africa. They chose Stellenbosch, a historic university town renowned for its Cape Dutch architecture, world-class wine estates, and breathtaking mountain scenery. Within months of their return, they moved into a spacious home at number 12 Gosk Street on the Dazals Golf Estate. The property represented everything they had worked for: security, comfort, and a place where their family could flourish. Rudy had returned to Australia to continue his engineering studies in Melbourne, but came home to South Africa for the Christmas break to spend time with his family. He was still there in late January 2015, enjoying the South African summer before returning to his academic pursuits. January 27, 2015, began as an ordinary evening for the Van Breda family. They shared dinner together and settled in to watch a Star Trek movie, the kind of quiet family ritual that marks the rhythm of comfortable domestic life. The estate around them was silent, homes locked behind security gates, residents secure in the knowledge that they lived in one of the most protected neighborhoods in the region. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, the peace shattered. What transpired in those dark hours would only be pieced together later through forensic evidence, emergency recordings, and the testimony of investigators, because the one person who could have described the events in detail, 16-year-old Marley, would lose all memory of that terrible night. Henri Van Breda would later tell police that he had gone to the bathroom in the early morning hours when he heard banging sounds echoing through the house. He claimed that when he opened a door, he witnessed a horrifying scene: someone attacking his brother Rudy with an axe. According to his account, he shouted for help, and his father Martin rushed in to confront the attacker, who was wearing a ski mask. Henri described hearing his mother's voice calling out, asking what was happening, and then chaos erupting as he claimed there may have been at least 2 attackers. He told police he fought with one of them, sustaining injuries before losing consciousness. The truth, as investigators would later determine, was far more sinister. Someone moved through the house with savage determination, wielding an axe with brutal efficiency. Martin Van Breda was attacked with such ferocity that he died from his injuries. Teresa Van Breda suffered the same fate, her life ending in a pool of blood on the first floor of their home. Rudy, the promising young engineering student, was struck down as well, his bright future extinguished in moments of unspeakable violence. The attacker then turned to Marley. The 16-year-old girl suffered severe head trauma as the axe came down again and again. The injuries to her head, neck, and throat were catastrophic, wounds inflicted with an almost unimaginable degree of brutality. But unlike her parents and brother, Marley clung to life, fighting to survive even as she lay critically injured in the carnage. Henri Van Breda, by contrast, bore only minor lacerations and superficial wounds. When the violence ended, he did not immediately call for help. Court records would later reveal that at 4:42 in the morning, a distressed Henri called his girlfriend multiple times, but the calls went unanswered. He then searched the internet for local emergency numbers. Nearly 3 hours would pass before he finally contacted emergency services at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning. The recording of Henry's call to emergency services would become a crucial piece of evidence, played repeatedly during the trial that followed. His voice, captured on the recording, told the operator, My family and me were attacked by a guy with an axe." He described his family members as bleeding from the head. But there was something else on that recording, something that would chill listeners and raise immediate suspicions. At one point during the call, Henri appeared to giggle briefly. When emergency responders and police arrived at 12 Gosk Street, they encountered a scene of unimaginable horror. Christian Kogelenberg, now retired but then among the first responders, would later testify about what he witnessed. Blood ran like a waterfall down the stairs. The home, which should have been a sanctuary, had become a slaughterhouse. Martin and Teresa Van Breda were found dead in pools of blood on the first floor. Nearby lay the body of 22-year-old Rudy. Marley was discovered still clinging to life, fighting against injuries so severe that it seemed impossible she could survive. Henri was found sitting outside the house, wearing only sleep shorts and white socks, both covered in blood. Police Sergeant Adrian Kleinhans, one of the first officers on the scene, would later testify that he smelled alcohol on Henry's breath. Emergency medical personnel rushed Marley to the hospital, where she underwent extensive surgery over the course of several months. The medical team managed to save her life through heroic efforts, but the injuries to her brain resulted in retrograde amnesia. Marley would have no recollection whatsoever of what had happened that night, no memory of who had attacked her family. The trauma had erased those terrible hours completely, leaving investigators without the testimony of their most critical potential witness. As paramedics worked to save Marley's life, investigators began the painstaking process of examining the crime scene at 12 Gosk Street. They recovered both an axe and a knife, items that were identified as belonging to the Van Breda household. Critically, investigators found no evidence of forced entry into the home. For a crime allegedly committed by one or more masked intruders, this absence of forced entry raised immediate questions. The blood evidence told a damning story. DNA testing revealed that the blood on Henry's shorts and socks matched his parents and brother. Police Captain Marius Joubert, a bloodstain pattern analyst, conducted a meticulous examination of the patterns found throughout the house. His analysis concluded that the blood spatter was inconsistent with Henry's statement about hiding in the bathroom while his brother was attacked. Instead, the patterns indicated that Henry had been in close proximity to the source of blood when force was applied. In other words, the blood evidence placed him right next to the victims during the attacks. Lieutenant Colonel Charlene Otto, the chief DNA analyst for the South African Police Service, tested 216 samples collected from the crime scene. The analysis identified DNA from Martin and Teresa beneath Henry's fingernails. Perhaps most significantly, the testing found no unknown DNA at the crime scene. If masked intruders had carried out this brutal attack, they had somehow managed to leave no genetic trace whatsoever, an outcome that seemed virtually impossible given the violence and chaos of the crime. The evidence suggested that Henry had tampered with the crime scene after the murders. His cell phone records showed searches for emergency numbers, revealing the delay between the attacks and his eventual call for help. Blood transfer stains on the bathroom floor indicated that blood-covered objects had been moved, but Henry could not explain these inconsistencies. Joubert testified that Henry had not explained why a duvet had been moved from his bed, or why Rudy's body appeared to have been repositioned. The prosecution's theory, which would later be presented in court papers, painted a chilling picture. It is believed that after the commission of the crimes, the accused tampered with the crime scene, inflicted injuries to his person, and supplied false information to the police in order to mislead police as to the true identity of the perpetrator. Despite the mounting evidence, Henry Van Breda was not immediately arrested. The investigation continued for more than a year and a half, with investigators building their case methodically. Some local news reports suggested that Henry contradicted his own story when speaking to detectives at the crime scene, inconsistencies that were noted against the recording of his emergency services call. But the legal process moved slowly, and it was not until June 2016 that Henry finally surrendered to authorities to face charges. On October 17, 2017, Henry Van Breda's trial commenced in the Western Cape High Court in Cape Town. He was charged with 3 counts of murder for the deaths of his mother Teresa, his father Martin, and his brother Rudy. He also faced a charge of attempted murder for the attack on his sister Marley, and an additional charge of obstruction of justice for allegedly tampering with the crime scene. To each charge, Henry entered a plea of not guilty. Judge Suraj Desai presided over the proceedings. The trial attracted massive media attention both within South Africa and internationally, shocking even a nation that had become grimly accustomed to high rates of violent crime. The case seemed to touch something deeper than ordinary criminal violence. This was a family annihilation, an act of fratricide and patricide that violated the most fundamental bonds of human connection. Henry's defense, led by lawyer Peter Botha, presented the account that Henry had given to police. According to this version of events, the family had spent a normal evening together. Henry had gone to the bathroom in the early morning hours, heard banging, and discovered a well-built black man wearing gloves and a balaclava attacking his family with an axe. The defense argued that Henry had fought with the attacker or attackers and sustained injuries before losing consciousness, which explained the delay in calling emergency services. The prosecution, however, systematically dismantled this narrative. Senior State Prosecutor Susan Galloway and her team presented the forensic evidence in methodical detail. Captain Joubert's bloodstain analysis demonstrated conclusively that Henry's account could not be reconciled with the physical evidence. The blood patterns on his clothing placed him directly beside the victims during the attacks. The DNA beneath his fingernails connected him physically to his parents. The absence of any unknown DNA eliminated the possibility of mysterious intruders. The 3-hour delay before calling emergency services became a focal point of the prosecution's case. The argument was presented that Henri had wanted his family to bleed to death. When asked to account for this devastating time gap, Henri could only repeat his claim that he had been unconscious. But the evidence suggested otherwise. His cell phone showed active internet searches during this period. The recorded emergency call played in court captured Henry's apparent lack of genuine distress, including the moment where he seemed to giggle. The prosecution highlighted his failure to show empathy or appropriate emotional response, both during that call and throughout the trial itself. These elements, combined with the physical evidence, created a portrait of someone who had committed unspeakable acts and then attempted to stage the scene to avoid responsibility. Cornelius Andries van Breda, Henry's uncle, provided testimony that offered insight into the family dynamics. He described his brother Martin and sister-in-law Teresa as loving people without enemies. He characterized them as a close-knit family. His testimony raised the haunting question that hung over the entire trial. If this warm, loving, successful family had no enemies, who would want to murder them in such a savage manner? And if the answer was no one from outside the family, then the horrifying conclusion became inescapable. On May 21, 2018, more than 3 years after the attacks, Judge Desai delivered his verdict. The judge found Henri van Breda guilty of murdering his mother Teresa, his father Martin, and his brother Rudy. He was also found guilty of the attempted murder of his sister Marley and guilty of obstruction of justice. Judge Desai stated that in light of the evidence presented, the verdict had been inescapable. The courtroom listened as the judge characterized Henry's actions. The attack had been savage and vicious, conducted with an almost unprecedented degree of disregard for one's family. Each murderous assault on a family member, the judge noted, constituted a severe crime that warranted the severest punishment. On June 7, 2018, Henri van Breda returned to court for sentencing. Judge Desai sentenced him to 3 life terms in prison for the murders of his mother, father, and brother. He received an additional 15 years for the attempted murder of Marley and 12 months for obstruction of justice. The judge noted that Henri had been a first-time offender and barely 20 when he carried out the attacks, but these factors could not mitigate the enormity of his crimes. Henry's girlfriend watched from the public gallery as he was led away to begin serving his sentence at Pollsmoor Prison. The following day, he was transferred to the Drakenstein Correctional Center, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Henri van Breda refused to accept the verdict. On November 7, 2018, he filed an application for leave to appeal both his conviction and sentence to the Supreme Court of Appeal. The appeal was dismissed. The evidence had been overwhelming, the verdict sound, and the sentence appropriate given the magnitude of the crimes. The unanswered question that haunted everyone who followed the case was the simplest and most devastating. Why? What could drive a 20-year-old man to take an axe to his sleeping family, to murder his parents and brother, to nearly kill his teenage sister? No clear motive ever emerged during the trial. There were no family feuds documented, no history of abuse, no disputes over inheritance or money that might explain such extreme violence. The family had been described repeatedly as close-knit and loving. Some speculated about Henry's state of mind, about possible substance abuse or mental health issues. The smell of alcohol noted by the first officer on the scene suggested he may have been drinking that night. But none of these factors could truly explain or justify what had happened in that house on the De Zales estate. For Marley van Breda, the aftermath of that January night meant rebuilding a life from fragments. She survived injuries that should have killed her, endured months of surgery and rehabilitation, and emerged with permanent brain damage and complete amnesia about the attack. She lost her parents, her older brother, and the brother who had tried to murder her, all in one terrible night. At 16 years old, she became an orphan and the sole survivor of a family massacre, unable to testify at the trial because she could remember nothing of the events that destroyed her family. The broader community of Stellenbosch and the Die Zaal's estate struggled to comprehend how such horror could unfold in their midst. The case became a reminder that evil does not announce itself, that it can emerge from the most unexpected places, even from within families that appear successful and harmonious on the surface. The Van Breda case stands as a testament to the power of forensic science in modern criminal investigation. Without Marley's testimony, without any surviving eyewitness who could describe what happened, the prosecution relied on blood spatter analysis, DNA profiling, and the meticulous reconstruction of crime scene evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Henri Van Breda had murdered his family. The 216 DNA samples tested, the blood patterns analyzed on Henry's clothing, the genetic material found beneath his fingernails, the absence of any unknown DNA, the unexplained time delay, the staged crime scene, the inconsistencies in his account. All of these elements combined to create an irrefutable picture of guilt. The case demonstrated how physical evidence can speak when human voices are silenced, how blood and DNA can tell stories that words cannot obscure. The axe and knife used in the attacks had come from the Van Breda home itself. There was no forced entry. The violence had erupted from within, not from without. These simple facts carried enormous weight, dismantling Henry's story of masked intruders and revealing the terrible truth. The greatest danger to the Van Breda family had not come from strangers but from one of their own. Today, Henri Van Breda remains imprisoned at Drakenstein Correctional Center, serving 3 concurrent life sentences. Marley Van Breda lives with the permanent consequences of her injuries and the loss of her family. The home at 12 Gosk Street on the Die Zaal's estate stands as a silent monument to a family destroyed. The golf course continues to attract players, the vineyards still produce their wines, and life on the estate goes on, but the shadow of January 27, 2015 lingers. The Van Breda family murder case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of violence and the limits of our understanding. We may never truly know what drove Henri Van Breda to commit such unspeakable acts against the people who loved him. The answers died with Martin, Teresa, and Rudy, and whatever lies in Henry's heart remains locked away behind his continued denials. What remains is the evidence, the verdict, and the devastating loss of 3 lives, along with the permanent damage to a 4th. In a home meant to shelter and protect, on an estate designed for comfort and security, a family was torn apart in the darkest hours of the night, and South Africa was left to grapple with one of its most shocking domestic crimes.